In 1564, the year that gave England Shakespeare, Galileo was born in Pisa, in Italy, the cradle of the Renaissance. But Galileo was predestined for trouble. His father was as argumentative as Galileo was to become. The open-minded and broad education that the young Galileo was given in music, literature, art, and science guaranteed that he could never hold his tongue and suffer in silence.
I think one of the significant things about Galileo's youth was the influence of his father, Vincenzo Galilei. Now, the thing about Vincenzo was that he was very important in the musical revolution of the time, and he helped to progress music from medieval polyphony to more modern sort of musical structures. Now, the significance of that for Galileo himself was that his father held very strong views about the negative impact of rigid theory. His view was that dogmatic views about how music should be performed effectively prevented music from developing. Now, if you look at Galileo's later career as a scientist, you find that he's trying to present exactly the same argument as his father. He held quite firmly that rigid views, in these cases the views of the Aristotelians and the scholastics, when held dogmatically, prevented the development of science. And that was something that I think one could say summarised his whole career as a scientist, the way he put himself in opposition to that kind of dogmatic view of science.
Most of his childhood is unrecorded, but as a young boy, his fascination with mechanics showed that even then his was an inquiring, unfettered mind. It was this attitude that was to lead later to triumph and catastrophe. Under the watchful eye of his father, Vincenzo, Galileo learned to paint, play the lute, and write poetry. In the dangerous days that awaited him, his music and painting provided a great source of comfort. The boy Galileo did not go to school formally until 1574, when the family moved to Florence.
The tremendous importance of the Renaissance was a sudden upsurge of interest in knowledge, the rediscovery of the works of people such as Plato, and a renewed interest in the kinds of ideas that people like Plato were putting forward, plus developments in music, in the arts, and Galileo fits very well into that framework indeed.
Medical school at university in Pisa brought the first rumbles of discontent and tilts against authority that were to become his hallmark and downfall. There, his stormy temperament earned him nothing more than the nickname the Wrangler. And it was at Pisa that he first came up against the theories of the Greek philosopher Aristotle that were to dog him at every turn. It was the fight to cut out the dead wood of Aristotle's theories, unquestioned for centuries by church and state alike, that proved his undoing. From now on, the shadow of Aristotle was to blight his life. Galileo never accepted any statement at face value. Proof by experiment was what he demanded, a new and exciting attitude. Only one episode in his university career pointed to the way the young firebrand was to spend the rest of his life.
Galileo noticed that a chandelier swinging in the University of Padua always had the same time of swing. This is to say it was isochronic, which means that the swing from one side to the other took the same amount of time whether the swing was this far or this far. It actually only applies with smaller angles, but essentially it laid the basis for a way of forming a clock, because there was a regular period of time between the one side of the swing and the other, no matter however long the swing might be.
The story itself may or may not be apocryphal, but in some ways it stands for the kind of science that Galileo was presenting, and therefore has enormous symbolic value. And I think its significance lies in two areas in particular. The first is that the observation itself is what scientists call counterintuitive. In other words, it's very unexpected. the idea that a pendulum will have the same period, in other words, it will take the same length of time to swing no matter how far out it is a counterintuitive observation. So I think that's one element of its significance, but far more important, I think, in terms of the story of Galileo, is it's a story about exact mathematical measurement of the world as observed. Now, Galileo, as you know, was a mathematician. He was passionately dedicated to mathematics, but it wasn't simply an interest in mathematics as a subject in its own right. He believed, and he's quoted as having said publicly, that the language of nature is written in mathematics. So for him, mathematics wasn't simply a tool and it wasn't simply an intellectual interest. It was the very script by which we would understand nature. So the story of the swinging chandelier is symbolic of his dedication to the idea of exact measurement of natural phenomena, rather than sitting back and speculating about it, as he accused the Aristotelians of doing.
He despised blind adherence to authority, and he found medical studies full of such unthinking obedience. As a result, he left university in 1585 without a degree. True or not, the story of the chandelier shows that Galileo was fascinated by measurement and the problems of physics. As yet, Galileo was an unknown force in the world of science. True, after leaving university, he had immersed himself in mathematics and physics, but he needed recognition and a university chair in order to carry out research and take his studies further. His frustration grew. Nevertheless, he turned his powers of analysis to the problems of gravity and flotation and began to establish his reputation. Then, in 1588, he was invited to address the Academy of Florence. This was the chance he had been praying for, and he seized the opportunity greedily, preparing himself with razor-sharp clarity and attention to detail. He was ready to challenge the world. And surprisingly, he did so with tact, not a quality for which he was later to be known, combining mathematical analysis with a thorough knowledge of modern and ancient literature to deliver a triumphant lecture. His reputation was assured. Soon he had the post he longed for. In 1589, the Wrangler, now aged 25, was appointed professor of mathematics at his old university, Pisa. And he would stay true to his name. From the new status he had acquired, he would swoop down on narrow-minded thought, smash the dead hand of ignorant authority. His attack started immediately.
The experiment at the Tower of Pisa possibly never happened. It's been much debated over the years. Aristotle's theory was that bodies fell according to their weight, so the heavier the body, the faster it would fall. Galileo disagreed with this and actually disproved it, but he did this mathematically. The experiment itself may never have actually taken place, but the idea would be that you would drop two equally sized and equally shaped bodies in the same medium, i.e. in this case air, and they would drop at different rates, or at the same rate. If they dropped at the same rate, it would show that Galileo was correct. They did drop at the same rate. Galileo was correct.
Galileo's approach to science was innovative and revolutionary. In an age of superstition, he was bound to arouse suspicion. But in using mathematics to solve the problems of physics, and in his geometrical and numerical analysis of the way the world works, he set the pattern for research to the present day. Yet within this approach lay the seeds of his downfall, for in his treatise On Motion, written at this time, he shows himself open to the thought that the Earth rotates on its own axis. From there, it was only a small step to accepting and promoting the view first put forward by the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, who had died some 45 years before. He had declared that the Earth orbited the sun and was not the center of the universe. The heliocentric doctrine. Aristotle's view, exactly the opposite, was in line with teachings of the Church. To defy it meant to face a charge of heresy and to risk the horrible death that this brought in its wake. It was the challenge to this view that brought the house down around Galileo's head.
I think it's important to emphasise that Galileo was not arguing against Aristotle per se. Indeed, in one of his later pamphlets, he explicitly says that he believes that Aristotle, had he been alive at the time of Galileo, would have subscribed to the Galilean principles that he was expounding. Both men were committed to the view that in order to understand nature, one had to observe nature very carefully. But what Galileo was arguing against wasn't Aristotle per se, but the Aristotelians of his own day. People who had taken Aristotle's theories and turned them into dogma. People who refused to accept alternative propositions. There is, for instance, a story of one of his colleagues at the university, a professor, who refused to look through Galileo's telescope for fear of what he would see. Because to this man, he knew what the universe was like because Aristotle had told him what it was, and he believed it implicitly and saw no further need to examine it more closely.